Good. Thanks, everybody, for coming in out of a beautiful sunny spring afternoon. And it's nice to see old friends and new faces, and look forward to follow up over beer within the hour, I promise. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about ICES and who we are and what we do. And apologies to those of you who know a lot of this already, but it's important background. And then talk about some of the fairly significant changes that are happening in some cases globally, climate change, and in some cases more regionally, such as Brexit, and how ICES is adapting to these changes, and the challenges that we face as an organization at this juncture in the world, I guess. So let me begin by telling you a little bit about the organization. We've been around a long time. You can probably see a lot of that in my gray hair and wrinkles, but not all of it. And please don't try to find my image in the upper photograph. You may see something that looks like me, but since 1902, so it's the world's oldest marine science organization. And it's an intergovernmental science organization, which today has 20 members, but had only 8 when it was first established. And it was established by luminaries from the Northeast Atlantic, who were both excellent scientists and visionaries in terms of the sense of the importance of collaboration and how important collaboration would become in the years to come. So even though we have only 20 member countries, we have participation much more broadly. And I'll talk to you a little bit about our structure and how we provide fora for scientists from many different disciplines. And that makes us very strong. So we have a network which really, I think, is unique. And that is perhaps the essential feature of ICES that underscores our success over the last way more than 100 years. We draw from thousands of experts, and you'll probably see this 4,000 number portrayed differently in some of the other slides, because there are some differences of opinion about how you count, which is not unusual for an organization which also tries to estimate fish abundance. But we draw very broadly, mainly from government agencies, but also from academia, and way above and beyond our 20 member countries. And we have a staff of about 75 people, many of whom have scientific expertise. And they really are both wonderful people, very international in flavor, and really make a huge difference and are essential to our success as an organization. Just a slight diversion, the senior full-time member of the ICES staff secretariat, we call General Secretary. And many of you know our current General Secretary, Alan Haney, who started a year and a half ago. And he's brought some real leadership and forward thinking to the organization. So there's a fairly strong NOAA Northwest flavor to ICES, which is, I think, unusual and probably won't persist indefinitely, certainly won't since my term as president expires towards the end of this year. We went through a strategic planning exercise in 2019, and I think it's important just to bear in mind our vision and mission in terms of leadership in marine science, and our vision that extends, again, beyond the North Atlantic, with more and increasing participation in global fora. And we have very, very strong partnerships with other similar organizations. The strongest is with ICES. And I think quite a number of you in this room have worked at some of these joint working groups with ICES and ICES, where some really important, significant science has been done over the last perhaps 20 years. This tells you a little bit about the organizational structure, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the details here. The 20 member countries each have 2 delegates, and they form the council. And they're the governing council of the organization. When the council meets annually, each member country has a single vote. In most cases, the membership of the delegates, which are assigned by the national agencies, consist of somebody from the science side and somebody from the management side. When I get into the advisory functions of ICES, I'll talk a little bit more about how that works. But since the US, and for that matter, Canada, don't take advantage of the advisory functions of ICES, but only participate in the science activities, we, I think, are perhaps unique in that one of our delegates is from NOAA, and one of them is academic. And at this point, that's John Hare, who took on my job at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center as the director, and Anne Buckland from the University of New Hampshire. There's a committee structure that is important, and you'll see why in a couple of minutes. The two most important committees in the organization really are the Science Committee and the Advisory Committee, and I'll talk a little bit more about their functions. And as you can see here, there's organizational structure beneath that, which is essential because our reach is so broad and we have so many different, what we call expert groups, which are working groups or workshops or whatever, that meet on an annual basis. And so organizing and providing guidance and support to those groups so that they can do the science that we really want them to do is essential. So in a nutshell, our role is to do science, create knowledge through science, and through that science provide objective advice to managers and policymakers, which we call knowledge translation. Now, these 7 icons to the left here are the science priorities that were identified during the strategic planning exercise. And you'll see as I continue with this talk that most of them are just as important now as they were back in 19 and even earlier. Here, a little bit more about the organizational structure, but what's really important, I think, is the linkage between science, advice, and data. We have a very, very strong data and information section and big responsibilities in that area, which I'll provide some detail of it in a minute or two. Talked a little bit about the science network, and this is an attempt to portray the breadth and depth of that network. And when I spoke a minute ago about our working groups and workshops, it's important to note that the scientists who participate in these activities volunteer. They volunteer in the sense that we don't pay them. They're paid by the home governments or through grants and other arrangements to participate. And they find this rewarding because not only can they bring their science into a forum of their peers, but they can take home what they learn. And through collaboration, remarkable work is done. I think we all know that, and we all know how important that has become in recent years. And I think the way that ICES functions really epitomizes that. Some of you also have undoubtedly participated in symposia that are co-sponsored by ICES, and each year we accept proposals for co-sponsoring symposia. And this is just an example of the symposia that we have or we will co-sponsor this year. And then the big annual event is the ICES Annual Science Conference. And my guess is that quite a number of you have attended. And if you haven't yet and you're still early in your career, it's really a worthwhile thing to do. And I can give you some advice on how to find funding if you're an early career scientist through the National Science Foundation, if you can get an abstract accepted for presentation. We rotate, but not in a very strict way, among the member countries in holding the annual science conference. This year it's going to be in the United Kingdom, in Gateshead, which is, of course, as you all know, very near Newcastle in the northeast of England. We have perhaps a unique role in terms of an organization like this, providing advice, as I said, to managers and to policymakers. And while this advice was originally rather tightly focused on fishing opportunities, on harvest levels, it's become much broader over the years. And the extent to which we are viewed as a honest and unbiased provider of scientific advice is, again, perhaps unique. In a way, the way that we work in terms of supporting our advice requesters, otherwise known as clients, is the way that NOAA works in terms of the science centers supporting the regional offices, because the science is done in the US in one part of the organization, and then it's provided through the various checks and balances of the Magnuson Act to decision makers and managers. And there is not a similar structure in Europe, but instead there is this recognition of and support for the work that ICES does in providing very much the kind of advice that the science side of NOAA fisheries provides to managers. And we have fairly strict structure in the way that we do things, partially because as a large organization, it's important to make sure that what we do is defensible and reproducible. And also because built into this are very strong checks and balances in terms of quality control and quality assurance, which reassures the clients of the integrity and the quality of the work behind the advice and the appropriateness, if you will, of the advice itself. This just outlines the process in general, but it really doesn't need any further discussion. I think I probably repeated myself here. Okay, let's get, yeah, okay. So in 2023, we provided advice on 198 fish stocks. You can see how it's broken down to some extent. I'll provide more detail in a moment. And the non fishing opportunity advice, as I mentioned before, has just become increasingly important, as has the importance of providing ecosystem considerations in the single stock advice. And we provide on a regular basis very comprehensive overviews of the various ecosystems in which we do provide advice, and also more recently extending into aquaculture, and of course for the fishing opportunities as well. Key requesters of advice, you can see from the map here. The biggest requester of advice is the EU, and within the EU, it's primarily but not exclusively DG Mare, which is the Director General that is responsible for carrying out the directives of the Common Fisheries Policy. More recently, we have the UK, which of course was part of the EU until recently, and I'll get back to that in a moment. But we have diverse needs and interests that we are providing to our clients in this region of the Atlantic, and even in the EU. I said that our primary client is DG Mare. Increasingly, we're providing advice to DG Environment on the Marine Strategy Framework Directives, which are focused on improving environmental quality in a number of different areas in the marine sector. And here I'm going to just show a couple of examples of some of the more complex advice requests that we've dealt with in recent years that show how we're able to bring expertise together to look more broadly at some of the contemporary challenges, and that this is really becoming increasingly important in the marine space in the Northeast Atlantic. And this sort of move towards and through EBFM to EBM, I'll again talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But there's certainly a great deal of interest and support for broadening the perspectives that are brought to bear in the advice that we provide. In some cases, that's explicit in terms of questions being asked about particular aspects of the ecosystems and change that's happening and how they respond to possible changes. Just in summary, then, talked about this before, we provide overviews on ecosystem, fisheries, and aquaculture, viewpoints which are infrequently produced, but are really sort of a light version of overviews. The regular advice, which is really the recurrent advice that's the bread and butter of catches, by increasingly things like bycatch and habitat. And then special requests, which are these more complex requests. For example, we received a request recently from the EU, from DG Mare, relative to marine spatial planning with regard to the really rapid development of offshore wind in Europe, which we're also seeing here. Also more of that in a minute. A little bit about ICES data and information. It's sort of the lifeblood of the organization, and we act as a repository and quality control mechanism for vast quantities of data from different sectors of the marine space, if you will. And again, we're trusted because of our data and information process and enterprises is certified, but also because it's work that we've done for years, and we've built this trust through the quality of the work that has been done. Just another cut on the types of data that we manage and provide portals to make available, both for our own analytical work and for others, scientists and other users of the data. And this is under data and information, but it's broader work that we've done to develop tools to allow relatively easy access to some of our advisory products, such as stock assessments, through the what we call the TAF. It's I forgot what the T was for. It's an advisory framework, but it lets you go in and interrogate data sets that are used for assessments and try different approaches to solving assessment problems. And the Advice Explorer, which lets you go in interactively and look at historically advice that has been provided to our different clients. Transparent advice framework, that's what the T is for. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit now about some of the changes that we're seeing and how we're adapting. And most of these changes, most of these challenges in broad brush sense are probably no surprise. Certainly climate change, offshore renewable energy development in the face of climate change. The war in Ukraine, you might be asking yourself why that's a particular challenge, but it's quite an interesting one. And Brexit. So let me focus on each of those a little bit. Climate change, of course, is the overarching challenge for all of the work that all of us do. And it's realized in many different ways. But ICES, in particular together with Pisces, but in other collaborative arenas, has a very strong track record of working on and developing the science to help us better understand the effects of climate change on marine ecosystems. So we have considerable capacity, but the capacity is inadequate because the demands for trying to answer some of these questions and provide guidance to policymakers is is growing faster than we can adapt. And so you saw in the earlier slide about the organizational structure, we have strategic initiatives which we set up to try and bring expertise together to solve different kinds of problems. And here I cite two of these strategic initiatives. This SIIECS, which is the strategic initiative for integrating early career scientists in the work of ICES, and the SIGE, which is the strategic initiative on graduate education, both designed to help us build capacity and bring expertise, talent, and perspective into the network that we lack and that we will certainly, if we don't need it now, need in the future. A little bit more about that in a moment as well. As in many parts of the world, there's increasing ecosystem considerations in single stock advice as a first step towards the ecosystem approach and being able to recognize indicators of climate change. And then, as I mentioned before, increasing advice requests focused on marine ecosystems and trade-offs. And one of the things that's made us keenly aware of is the need to attract and engage social scientists, economists, the human areas of marine science that we have not traditionally embraced. And there's very interesting dynamics among the member countries with regards to the importance of providing advice that includes human dimensions and the extent to which, in some cases, the clients are ill at ease about ICES providing that kind of information because they feel that that's more in a policy than in a science area and that they need some room to maneuver rather than have their hands tied. But that's an ongoing and rather interesting debate. The linkages between climate change and some of the other challenges, particularly, as you'll see, the Ukraine war and Brexit, are also, I think, quite fascinating. And then, of course, there's our own housekeeping. One of the ways that we have maintained our organization and kept people interested in engaging and building their career and building personal relationships that are important as well is through physical meetings. And so a lot of travel has historically gone on to support the ICES enterprise. Of course, we managed without that during the pandemic, but we're having a big struggle figuring out how to manage that in a hybrid world in the future while still maintaining the essential essence of the organization. Offshore renewables has emerged very, very rapidly, and I think is a game changer in a lot of ways. Clearly, when I talked about linkage with the other challenges that I mentioned, the Ukrainian war is a really interesting one because, of course, the quest for energy independence from the Northern European countries has doubled and redoubled under the circumstances that were created by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the lack of or concerns about dependence on fossil fuels that come from Russia. So a movement which was taking place is now taking place even more rapidly. And the policymakers are so keen on moving forward with implementing offshore renewable energy approaches that it's very, very difficult to have rational arguments about where and where they should be sited, looking at impacts on fisheries, habitat, scientific data collection, et cetera, et cetera. And we think that this is perhaps one of the first examples of changes in the marine space, which are really going to require broad collective efforts that begin to realize the vision of ecosystem-based management. So we've begun to figure out what it is that we can do to facilitate that process and how we can build on our expertise and our reach, if you will, into the broad scientific community to enable a more a more deliberative approach, even under this extreme pressure to move things quickly. So this is really an area that I think is one of great opportunity for us, but it's also one which creates many challenges, because the kinds of expertise that are needed to do this properly are way broader than our current reach. And so how we build the right kind of collaborations and show what it is that we can do to help this societal challenge, I think is going to be a test of ICES in the coming years. In Ukraine is important to us in another way as well, because the Russian Federation is one of the 20 members of ICES, and it has been for a long time, and it is an essential member, both in the sense of the science that Russian scientists bring to the organization, and in terms of the shared stocks, particularly in the Barents Sea, but also elsewhere, that we provide advice on harvest levels. So it was a really enormous challenge for us as an organization to look at how best to respond given the invasion of Ukraine. And it's one that took a great deal of my time in an area that I did not expect to have to work, in terms of trying to find a solution that would work for all of our member countries. And a number of our member countries are very close to Russia in the Baltic Sea, have had, shall we say, unpleasant experiences in interactions with Russia over long periods of time. So there's a suspicion and discomfort, and also a very clear unhappiness about the action that was taken. And we were really faced with having to deal with countries which were themselves willing to withdraw from ICES rather than to continue to work in ICES with what had formerly been Russian colleagues. And so we took this unprecedented step to suspend Russia from ICES. And of course, that produced a very unpleasant reaction from Russia, which continues. But we made a commitment that we would revisit this on a regular basis, and we're hopeful, of course, that we'll be able to reverse the suspension. At the same time, not only is it a sort of a geopolitical challenge and a challenge for us as an organization, it's a challenge for many of our members in different ways as well, where there are shared stocks that have depended on ICES advice to reach agreeable bilateral or multilateral negotiations on allocation. This has become difficult and in some cases impossible. For example, in the Barents Sea, where the cod and haddock stocks are shared by Russia and Norway, they are now working independently to maintain an ICES-like structure, but we're unable to carry out the normal functions of providing ICES advice in the assessments and on the advice that's delivered for those stocks. Impacts are much broader. We have a growing role in science that's taking place in the Arctic. And of course, the uncertainty with regards to what the structure of international organizations is going to look like is just exacerbated by our inability and the inability of other organizations to work with Russia. So that's another strategic challenge for us. Brexit, a different kind of scale, but also one that has some interesting implications for us. And interestingly, I was on the phone this morning with Alan Haney and also with Carl O'Brien, who's going to most likely take over from me as ICES president, as he's the senior fisheries advisor to the UK government. And I asked them both what they thought the greatest impact of Brexit was on ICES and the way we function. And the immediate impact is we have one more entity to deal with, where we're negotiating and providing advice to the EU. We're now providing advice on, in many cases, the same stocks to the EU and to the UK. We've done this, of course, for a long time with other countries, including Norway. But the UK has such a big footprint in the North Atlantic fisheries and a very strong desire to cut its own path, if you will, in how it does the science and management, that does bring some interesting challenges. I thought at first, in my naive way, that we might be able to actually profit from this because we would have additional countries paying us for the same advice. But that's not how we operate. In fact, we have a stock sharing, a cost sharing structure relative to stocks. So all we do is just split the cost across additional clients. But there are additional advice requests that come just from the EU or just from the UK or from the UK and Norway that we entertain, and we provide fees. We are provided fees for those services. So, of course, all of these changes have impacts on our capacity, on our resources, and our priorities. We have two sources of income primarily. One is national contributions. Each member nation provides an amount of money each year that was negotiated. So different countries have different shares. But it's very, very difficult to get the whole council to agree to increases in those national contributions for various reasons, while costs go up and up and up, particularly for staff, but also for the additional services that we provide. And while we receive fee for service in providing advice, we don't recover all of the costs. And that's an issue that is quite difficult to address with the different clients and the way that they are funded. But it is a challenge for us. Our network is strong. We are able to build and grow that network, but it does require additional resources. So I think if you go back and look at our vision and mission statements in terms of this interest in building on what it is that we've brought to marine science and the advisory process in more than 100 years, we're on a firm foundation. And I think there are strong opportunities for us to build on that. I've touched on some of those already. But there are difficulties associated with increasing the size of an organization. We function fairly well with 20 members and with a staff the size that we have. So how do we find a balance that allows us to maintain our integrity and quality, but enables us to adapt in a world where things are changing? And among those things, which I alluded to earlier, are these various strategic initiatives which allow us to attract more interested scientists and build more capacity and just broaden the understanding of who we are and what we do and how we can contribute to evolving needs for marine science. The strategic initiative on graduate education, I know with the light in my eyes, I can't see if Tim's in the room, but he and I worked on creating the foundation for this. And really, our thinking has been that we want to take advantage of the strengths of different universities that provide graduate education in marine science within ICES countries, and potentially build graduate programs which would allow students to spend some time at different institutions or build a research portfolio that draws from that broader expertise, so that we can build an incoming wave of scientists who have the broader perspective and the awareness of the challenges that we're facing, and bring that together. And I think we're very, very keen on fully engaging early career scientists, which I'll get to in a moment, but in students who are involved in graduate education in the work that we do. So this is a new initiative, but it's one that is explicitly designed to help us address these capacity needs. ICES Strategic Initiative on Climate Change. I just wanted to come back to this because I think that's, again, a really important ongoing strategic initiative, which underscores what it is that we can bring together with our partners to the science challenges related to climate change on marine ecosystems. We have a new steering group which recognizes the importance of the human dimension. And again, that's responding to the growing need for broader-based science, which recognizes the human dimension, social sciences and humanities, economics, in all of the things that we do, and helps us be confident that we can address transdisciplinary challenges, such as the one that I mentioned a few minutes ago, relative to offshore wind and ecosystem-based management. I could talk forever about ICES, and I think you've probably heard enough from me, but I want to make sure that there's some opportunity for questions. And I really look forward to hearing your feedback and to trying to answer whatever questions you might have. This is a suggestion for some reading if you want to learn more about ICES and who we are, or about fisheries in Europe. And I'd be happy to provide some additional references to anybody who's interested. So hopefully there's still some time left for some questions, and thank you very much. Rita.
There was once a time when it was thought that humans couldn't overfish the ocean. And I'm just interested in how over the years, maybe there was a shift from how to find the fish that you could potentially catch to how to protect the fish from overfishing.
It's interesting you should say that, because it makes me recall a conversation I had with Ole Mathisen. I don't know if you remember him, a long, long time ago. And he was a Norwegian who came to the US as a young man, and who was interested in and had expertise in a lot of different areas. And one of them was acoustics. And he said something like, now we've given them the tools to find every last fish, we're really in trouble. And right,
He's sounded larger because
yes, yes. I was going to come back to that. Yes, that's right. I mean, I mean, it's been a real concern for a long time, but I think technology certainly perhaps made it more of a concern, and perhaps increased the need for rational management. And one of the areas that has been lacking in a lot of countries is proper documentation of what's removed. I mean, we're still, globally, we're dealing with these challenges with regards to illegal fishing, but that's still a problem closer to home. There was a huge problem in the Northeast when I was there, relative to misreporting and overfishing. Because I'm no longer there, perhaps it's no longer a problem. But and it's one of the issues which concerns the Norwegians in this challenge about how to continue to engage Russia during the war in Ukraine. So there are global aspects, as well as just the sort of hands-on, how do you properly manage and be satisfied that you're estimating fishing mortality correctly. It's a good question. It's a really interesting book to read, but it's very academic in its style. And I think the problem, which is a problem that those of us who've worked in different areas for NOAA face, is that the more you share about the details of what you do, which is essential, even outside the science arena, the more criticism you're going to get. I certainly that's true when you deal with the commercial fishing industry, but I think at least that's one of them. It is the paradoxes of that. I won't try and recall the rest of it. We could have a conversation. I'd go back and read the book, then we can have a conversation. Read the book again. I'm sorry, I haven't read it. Bill.
So
What in history on the assessment side, assessment methods and the reference points, and on the management side, and how decisions are taken, especially empowerment of scientific committees legally. What's been going on the European side?
Depends which country, but if you take the EU as an example, the EU has the common fisheries policy has some strong similarities and some strong differences to Magnuson-Stevens. But there is a requirement for best available science, and there are mechanisms for checks and balances. Some of them are carried out by ICES on behalf of the clients, but also within the EU, there's an organization called STECF, which is the Scientific, Technical, and Economic Committee on Fisheries, which was originally, I think, supposed to play a role similar to the SSCs. But I think that that's become weaker and is even weaker now following Brexit, because the UK does not participate in that committee, because the UK is not subject to the common fisheries policy. It's subject to its own fishing law. So again, I think there's more focus on what it is that ICES can do as a trusted provider of science. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah, it's an essential part of the process. And bringing in expertise from outside of the ICES area is also essential, which is the same as what NOAA does for benchmarks as well, or often does. One of the things that we're struggling with more than there than here is stakeholder engagement. Most of the processes which NOAA is engaged in to providing this kind of advice are completely open, and there's great opportunity for members of the public, whatever that means, to speak up and share, bring information, ask questions. That's harder to do in the ICES structure, and we're actually working very hard to broaden that kind of engagement. Right.
So in theory, there's a split between science, transparent, independent, and then management advice. But certainly in the US, what's happened is scientists have been very influential in formulating the structure, whether it's how you rebuild a fish stock or what your reference points are, etc. How does that work in ICES? Is there really a split, or has the ICES science process been pretty instrumental in formulating the sidebars on management?
Yes and no. I went to Brussels 2 or 3 months ago because we had received a letter from DG Murray with regards to whose role, whose responsibility it was to adjust reference points, and to what extent that was science and to what extent that was policy. So it's less clearly resolved. And I think that part of the problem is that even though the science that we do is transparent and open to engagement, the clients that we deliver that science to very often are not in the room, don't have the time to observe process, but they deal with the consequences, which may be political or maybe from the stakeholders. And so again, that's a sort of paradox of transparency as well, in terms of we're transparent in what we're doing, but they're not necessarily availing themselves of what it is, the process behind the advice that's delivered. But it's evolving, and in some ways, I think Brexit is forcing the EU to recognize where it has perhaps failed in the past, because now there are more players that bring more power into whatever negotiations there are. And so I'm curious to see how that evolves. Another sort of strange construct in ICES is that in the case of the UK, in the case of Norway, they're member countries of ICES. And so they have a vote at the council. They provide membership dues. The EU doesn't. The EU has maybe a dozen countries that are ICES members, but the EU itself is not an ICES member, even though they are our biggest client. And when some of these issues have come up, and I've said to the bureaucrats at the EU, have you had this conversation with the delegates from your member countries or the members of ACOM and SICOM from your member countries? They haven't done that. So that's where the system breaks down a little bit more than it does here, where the channels are clearer and the lines of communication are clearer. Jeremy.
We usually the US like so is it a challenge Canada and the US sort of in train in the process that their scientists don't see how their science are feeding into the advice?
It hasn't been. I mean, certainly there's been much more involvement in the case of the US from the Northeast and Canada from the East than more broadly, except in the expert groups that are more focused on methods or broader based science. But I think the US certainly sees the benefits of engaging in that kind of international space to its own science. And Canada does as well, but it varies. It depends a lot on the current leadership. And Canada is going through its own struggles now relative to really seriously addressing carbon footprint challenges, which makes it much harder for them to fully engage in ICES in the way that they have in the past. And I think that itself is a message that we need to pay attention to.
Okay, well, let's thank Bill and carry on this conversation over here.
Thank you.